Hi everyone, I'm Ali, I'm an architect, and today we're going to talk about books for your Part 3 exam, so let's go. Okay guys, so today we're going to talk about something that one of my colleagues asked me, which is what books they should look at taking into their Part 3 exam. So if you're looking at doing a Part 3 exam, then you'll know that when you get to the actual examinations, then a lot of the time you're allowed to take books in with you. There is still some examination boards, I think, that allow you access to the internet, but I think that's becoming less and less common. So essentially you're allowed to take printed copies of the books in with you, and that's your entire reference material for the exam. So what we're going to do today is talk about what books I think you should take into the exam with you and why, and also some books generally that I think are great to look at for your Part 3. We're going to start with what books are great to take into the exam with you. So what you need to consider here is if you're allowed to take books into your exam with you, then you don't want to have loads and loads of reference material. So a mistake I made the first time I did my Part 3 is to take in loads of books thinking that, I'll be able to look up most things. If you're needing to look up books for the majority of questions, then you're not really ready to take your Part 3. You should generally have a good idea of what the answer is, and the books are really just for reference to help you fill in bits you're missing or the terminology for something specific, things like that. So not to give you full answers to questions, basically. And that's why you need to be quite kind of harsh with yourself and cut it down. The other thing is that you will not have time to look through like 10 different copies of books. So you need to have books that provide you like the broadest possible amount of information, but in the fewest possible books. And my shortlist for taking to the exam is 4 books. And then, maybe the night before I get nervous and slip in like an extra book or something. But these are the ones I think that are going to answer like 90% of questions you might have in the exam. So let's go through them. First up is The Architect in Practice. This is a really, really good book, and I'm going to be saying really, really a lot. This basically takes you through the process of running a job, of being an architect, but it's in detail and kind of tells you some specific things that come up that might be useful to know. Specifically around like contracts and things, it has a little paragraph on each kind of topic. It's laid out in a really easy to read way, which is really good if you're in an exam. You can find specifically the information you need and look at it. You can see I found it useful. You're going to see with most of these that they have a load of paper still in them and like notes on from my Part 3. So I think this is good. It's great reading pre-Part 3, but it's also a book that for me makes it into the exam with you because it can provide you that information on most topics and give you a little bit more information on answering questions for all stages of the project. So that's why this is great. Like we're saying, the most amount of information, but in the least amount of books. So that one is great. That makes the list. So the second one is Practice Management. It's one of 3 that are from the same suite from the RIBA. I got this one after I did my Part 3 the first time, or I think I maybe had it, but I properly read it after I did my Part 3 the first time. Because I worked at small practices, I wasn't super familiar with a lot of practice management and the kind of popular terminology for a lot of it. So this deals with things like people management, risk management, financial management, all those kind of things. A bit about the RIBA and ARB as well. All these 3 that I'm going to mention next kind of have overlapping topics in them, but they kind of look at it from different perspectives, which is what makes them really useful and really good to have with you in the exam. So that's number 2, which is brilliant. The third one is probably my favourite Part 3 book. So it's Law and Practice by the RBA. I really love contract law. I find it really interesting. So this is really interesting, and construction law as well specifically. So you can see how interesting I found this by the amount of notes that we still have in it. It basically gives you answers to the kind of questions you're going to be asked in your Part 3. Your Part 3 is focusing on the kind of legal framework that an architect operates within. And obviously this is Law and Practice, so it is literally that. That's why I find this one so useful. And as I say, there's topics in practice management and in the next book that overlap with this, and it comes at them from kind of legal, a law and practice perspective. So that's my third book, definitely coming into the exam with me. Most things where you're stumped, you don't know a terminology, or you just have kind of slightly forgotten something, but you're sure there is something, this book is a great one to have with you. And the final one, the fourth, I've kept the list really, really short on what you should have in the exam with you, is the Rba Job Book. So obviously the Rba Job Book is basically the encyclopedia of the RIBA plan of work. This is the 9th with the old plan of work, which is out of date now, but basically it's taking you through a job and obviously the plan of work, so each sort of stage of the plan of work. That makes it really, really useful for your part 3 because it's going to remind you of things that you might have forgotten, like when you should be talking to authorities, when you should be dealing with planning, contract law, tendering, all those kind of things. This is kind of just tracking along with you and giving you that information when you need it. And it's, again, all these ones are really, really easy to read, really, really easy to reference. So if you're in a panic in the exam for something, in these 4 books, there should be the answers to your questions. So that is my 4 books for the part 3 exam. So they're literally the ones I would have next to me as I'm filling out the written examinations whilst you're allowed books. There's often an examination where then you're not, or at least as specifically is in the AA where I did my part 3. So that's the first part of the video. Feel free to leave if you want. I'm going to go through some slightly more in-depth books that are also really, really useful. Again, this is not an exhaustive list and your 4 might be different. It's just that I think is a really good overall 4 for everybody. You might want an extra one, a 5th, that's on some topic that you particularly feel a little bit nervous about just to have there with you. But bear in mind, you have to take those actually in person usually to the exam with you. And the 4 I've picked are kind of quite heavy books, so bear that in mind. But yeah, we're going to look at some other things that are really important for you to familiarise yourself with for your part 3. And yeah, that you should just be reading up until your part 3, but that I don't think are quite useful enough to necessarily make it into the exam with you. And they kind of fall into that category we were talking about where you kind of become just fumbling around for information, but you're looking in too many sources and they're too in-depth or they're too detailed in a specific topic. And it's not actually helpful when you're in that examination situation. So the first one is one that I'm sure you're going to be aware of. That's probably been mentioned to you from masters onwards. That's Which Contract. So this is a really useful book. This is telling you about the kinds of construction contracts that there are and when each is appropriate, which is something really good to know, especially, well, that you need to know for your part 3, but also that it's really helpful to make sure that you're kind of aware of the differences between them because that's something that you might be questioned on in your examinations. So this book is something you should definitely familiarise yourself with. You don't need to know every single contract like super in depth, but you need to know the differences between the types and why they're different and what the benefits or negatives are of each of those. Basically to put you in a position as an architect where you could advise your client on a construction contract that is appropriate to them and the project that they're doing. So this kind of touches, this is I think an old copy. If there's a new one, I'll drop a link to it below. It deals with kind of the general broad types of contracts, so traditional design and build, management contracting, and construction management. So those 4. And yeah, basically gives you general information about each of those. It's a really good book to read, but I wouldn't necessarily buy it and I wouldn't necessarily take it into, I mean, I obviously own it, but I wouldn't take it into the exam with me. It's too detailed and in-depth specific and on the specific contracts that it talks about, but not others. And that's not necessarily helpful for your part 3 examination. Another book that I found really helpful, I might have taken this into the exam with me, but I don't think I used it, but I really, really love this book. You can see how much I love it from the amount of note tags, is Construction Law. So I like construction law anyway, I find it interesting, but this is the first book that I'd read that makes it really accessible and easily understandable. It's a really good book to read. And yeah, just very, very helpful for your part 3. So it deals with just generally the English legal system. I'm reading the back, tort and property law, procurement, subcontracting, partnering, and all that kind of thing. Also BIM and best practice around that, which is important and something that you're likely to be questioned on. And dispute resolution as well, and the different kinds of dispute resolution. So like, for example, I remember one of my questions from the part 3 exam, you could answer it from having just the back of that book. So it's really, really good. I'm going to say really, really a lot. I said that, I'm warning you. It's very, very useful, but I don't think it's necessarily useful enough to make my in the exam list. And you need to be really careful to not, give yourself a sort of avalanche of books to take into the exam. It might be, it depends on how familiar you feel with like all the concepts of this at the point where you actually sit your part 3 exam. Maybe it is the kind of book that makes it into your list. That is fair enough, but it is a great read. I definitely recommend it. And you should be familiar with everything within it in order to sit your part 3. Okay, the next is like a relation of the Architect in Practice book that made the cut. This is the Architect's Guide to Running a Job, which is a much simpler book that literally deals with like point by point things that an architect does in running a job. If you're in a position where you've maybe not seen a job from beginning to end, or you find it hard to have construction practice, like experience in the practice that you're in, this book's quite good in kind of understanding stages that might be a little bit vague to you, from like tendering through to construction. So it's quite a good read, but again, it deals with quite specific topics, and they're very, very interesting, but they're really small kind of bite-sized paragraphs or pages on each, which again is really good to take it in, but probably not helpful enough for the examination. So a great book to read as part of your revision for your part 3, and to just have as a reference if you're in a study group and things, but I don't think for me it makes the cut to take into the exam with you. The next is a book that I got because I felt I had a very specific view of tendering. So this is one of the like basics range of books on tendering. So there's loads of books on different things in these kind of basic ranges. This for me is something that I just wanted to kind of brush up on because I didn't feel I had a very good understanding of it before I was doing my part 3. So as part of my revision, I got this and gave it a read, and you can see there was some things that I wanted to note and a few corners that are folded. So it was quite useful for me, but then if you've had a lot of experience of that, this probably won't be your weak area. I think it's really important in your part 3 to try and figure out what it is that you know and what it is that you're weaker on, and kind of acknowledge that and fill in those gaps. So for me, this is an example of me doing that. Yours are probably different. But this basics range is quite good and has different books on different topics. It might have something useful for what you need. So yeah, a great read, great bit of revision, but very specific and too specific to take into the exam with you. A topic that almost always comes up in the part 3 is the CDM 2015 regulations. So what I had when I did my part 3 the first time is this book, which was just like a general guide. This is really good once you've done the kind of drawings that you need to do as principal designer and you understand them. Otherwise it can be quite a heavy book and kind of a bit too much in depth. So, but it does cover sort of everybody. It's like, it's for designers and architects, but it kind of does touch on the whole CDM regulations thing. This one is the Principal Designer's Handbook, which I find a lot easier to read and to use. And yeah, kind of details particularly what would usually be the architect's role in the situation. It's also a lot thinner. It's a lot easier to read. I think this is probably a better one, but basically I'm trying to highlight that you need to be aware of specifically that regulation and it's likely to come up. Another general tip is that you should make sure you're kind of up on the news just before you're doing your part 3, because usually things that are in the news will come up in the part 3. So at the moment, things like the ARB taking on CPD requirements as part of their codes of conduct, because previously it's just been the RIBA that has done that. Things like that are likely to be just asked about because they're new and they expect you to know about them and to keep up to date on the industry. So that's something to just be aware of as kind of side note. Okay, 2 more, guys. We're nearly there. So another one is a good practice guide. All the good practice guides from the RBA are great. Some are more relevant to part 3 than others. This is fee management. This is obviously relevant because it touches on both running a business and the cash flow management of that, and also the requirements that you need to have in your contracts, written appointments with your clients. So it's very good to know this. It's also really helpful for usually like case studies and things in understanding how that, if you're touching on that, I know different case studies touch on different things, but how that part of the process works. And it's something that also, if you're working in big practice, you might not have a lot of information about. You might not be party to those discussions, obviously. So this can be quite useful to kind of fill in those gaps. So this or any other good practice guides on things that you specifically think you need experience of or that you're missing, they're a really good place to go. And the last one is the guide to the Rba Agreement. So this is the guide to the written appointments with your client, so between architect and client, based on the RBA's own agreements. There are others, but this is kind of, a good one to know. And this book is obviously just a guide to their actual contracts, but it's really useful because it touches on things that are likely to come up on your part 3, such as copyright within those contracts and what the rules are around that. So this is something that, again, you should be kind of familiar with, and at least familiar with all the kind of concepts around it inside that book. So that's the kind of overview. Like I say, not an exhaustive list. I have a hell of a load of more books than that that I touched on at one point or the other or read when I was doing my part 3 revision. But I think that kind of gives you a general overview of all things that are useful. And I think most importantly are those 4 that I would take into the exam with me. So definitely this, this is heavy, definitely this, and definitely this. And they're also great books to take to like every study group with you, because anything you guys are discussing, there's probably answers in there. But yeah, let me know if you agree with my 4 picks, or if there's anything else that you would definitely take into the part 3 exam with you, or that you're thinking of taking in with you. Let me know in the comments below. I will drop links for those books in the description. It's going to be a long one. Thank you for watching, guys. I hope you have a great day wherever you are. Thanks. Bye. Hi, guys. Shit.